issues in the news. We'll begin with an analysis of the motives behind President Trump's bombing of the Syrian air base and the mixed signals coming from his administration, with his UN representative Nikki Haley advocating regime change, saying that there can be no peace in Syria with Assad in power, while Secretary of State Tillerson says there is no change in U.S. policy, with destroying ISIS still the main objective. Thomas Wright, a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution and author of the forthcoming book, All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, joins us to discuss the EU conference on reconstructing post-war Syria that was meeting in Brussels when the chemical attack occurred, raising doubts about whether the billions pledged will be forthcoming. Then we'll examine how much the bombing of Syria distracted attention away from the inquiries into possible collusion between the Trump administration and the Russians. Mark Lowenthal, the president of the Intelligence and Security Academy, who was the Republican staff chairman or staff director of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, joins us to discuss the damage that Devin Nunes has done to the House Intelligence Committee and how much it will impact the Russian investigations going forward. Then finally, following the cruise missile attack on Syria, with CNN's Fareed Zakaria declaring, quote, that I think Donald Trump became President of the United States last night. We will look into the cheerleading in the press that has accompanied Donald Trump's use of military force against the Assad regime, and speak with Eric Bollett, a senior fellow at Media Matters for America and author of Lapdogs, How the Press Rolled Over for Bush, and Bloggers on the Bus, How the Internet Changed Politics and the Press. He joins us to discuss the unusual praise for Trump, coming not just from the expected sycophants at Fox News, but from many of the anchors on MSNBC, such as Rachel Maddow and Brian Williams, who are normally critical of Trump. And joining us now is Thomas Wright, who's a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy, as well as a fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. His forthcoming book is All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power. Welcome to Background Briefing, Thomas Wright.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And there was an unexpected use of American hard power in Syria after years and years of wanting to stay out, and, of course, lots of Monday morning quarterbacking over the 2013 red line that was crossed, and Obama backed away from his threat, which led to a Russian brokered deal to get rid of Assad's chemical weapons, which clearly was not complete. So a little bit of history there, but what do you think was the motivation here? Was it because Trump watches a lot of television and was influenced by the pictures of these babies? He called them beautiful babies poisoned by this horrible gas. And it certainly has changed the conversation. So a lot of critics are saying, well, this is a kind of wag the dog situation where he's removing unpleasant coverage about possible involvement with the Russians from the headlines. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think what happened was a more sort of fundamental shift for President Trump. I think we have to start with the question, why did the attack take place? Like, why did Assad use chemical weapons in the first place? Obviously, he's used them on a small scale before, but this was a very provocative act. And I think the simplest explanation is probably true, which is that he thought Trump didn't care. He thought that he had a carte blanche to do what he wanted. Trump said repeatedly that he didn't mind what Assad did inside his own borders, that, you know, the U.S. didn't want to get rid of Assad, that he wanted to work with the regime against ISIS. So I think Assad thought, you know, the President of the United States and the Secretary of State are essentially saying, I have a green light to do anything I want. And then when he did launch the chemical weapons attack, I think Trump was confronted with what the logic, what America first leads to when taken to its logical conclusion, and it leads to mass atrocities and the very moving images that we all saw on television. And I think he had a gut sort of reaction, which was he couldn't just continue to give a carte blanche. He had to say that it wasn't acceptable, and he did. And the strike that took place, I think, was really the minimum sort of strike that you could conceive of that would register disapproval, you know. And so what he was essentially saying was, you know, I don't want you to use chemical weapons. It wasn't totally unlike what President Obama did either in 2013, even though he didn't sort of follow through in the strike. So I think that's sort of what it was. I'm not sure. I think he's saying that there's no carte blanche there, but he's also not sort of yet saying that he's going to intervene or fundamentally change his strategy or that he wants to get rid of Assad.
Well, do you think, though, that either he or Tillerson or Nikki Haley are sort of have any kind of remorse or rethinking what they said? If it did unwittingly give Assad a green light, I mean, the extent to which also you have to add to that, I think the images of General Sisi there being feted at the White House and treated very warmly by President Trump, that he's not exactly anything but a despot. He's got, 40 or 50,000 Egyptians in jail, he's using torture, etc. So do you think anybody in the Trump administration recognizes that maybe they unwittingly gave Assad the green light?
Well, if they do, I sincerely doubt they would say it publicly. You know, I mean, it's not the president's style to do that, and it would be obviously politically dangerous for them if they were to do so. So I wouldn't expect them to sort of acknowledge mistakes on that, even though I think it was a huge mistake to have the language they had in the run-up to it. But I think what people will be looking for is sort of a change in course. I will say that I think since the strike, I mean, there's been some mixed signals, including from Haley saying one thing, Tillerson saying another. But based on Tillerson's comments, it does seem we're going back to the status quo as it was before the chemical attack. You know, that they're saying so Tillerson said this morning that the counter-ISIS efforts are being coordinated with the Assad regime. He's saying ISIS is the first priority. I think what they're all hoping for is that Assad will sort of get the message, don't use chemical weapons, and then we can get back to the way it was. I expect that Assad will do that. I don't think Assad will really escalate here, and so I think I don't see it as sort of a fundamental sort of change in the long run. It was really a marker that was laid down to say, you know, that the United States didn't want WMD being used on a regular basis in Syria.
And again, I'm speaking with Thomas Wright, who's a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy, as well as a fellow in the Centre of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. His forthcoming book is All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power. So at this point, you just mentioned the contradictions between Nikki Haley on the Sunday program saying there's not any sort of option where a political solution is going to happen with Assad as a head of regime. Regime change is something that we think is going to happen because all of the parties are going to see that Assad is not the leader that needs to be taking place for Syria. Now, of course, Tillerson more or less said, no, our real priority is ISIS, and he's on his way to Russia, I imagine, to smooth the ruffled feathers there. But talk of greater cooperation with Russia. What's your opinion on that? Because I would have thought that this bombing would have driven Putin further into Assad's hands, or Assad further into Putin's hands.
Yeah, well, I think it will. I'm not sure exactly what impact it will have. I mean, you could see it either way. I mean, the Russians, there were some rumors that they may have been involved, but I think that it's also possible that they're upset with the regime for sort of jeopardizing the relationship with Trump. If you think about it from the Russian and the Assad sort of strategic point of view, I mean, their goal here has to be to prevent Trump from getting dragged into the war against them. You know, I think that's their major objective, because if they retaliate or if they're very sort of upset at the attack and they respond either by using chemical weapons again or in some other way, then that would be counterproductive for them, I think, because Trump could react badly to that and get more engaged, and that would tilt the balance of power. So I actually think that the Russians have an interest in trying to smooth this over. I wouldn't be completely surprised if they came up with a scapegoat for the attack in time and sort of disavowed it or said that it wasn't anything to do with them. And I think that the visit of Tillerson to Russia, the risk is not that it goes incredibly badly and they sort of fall out. I think the risk is still too much cooperation with Russia, sort of unilateral concessions. I don't think that risk has gone away. with the strike. I think the Russians have to, of course, condemn it, and they said that they'll strengthen Syrian air defense and those capabilities. But I haven't seen anything yet that would really sort of register like a serious, opposition to it and retaliation against the United States.
Well, the conference was taking place in Brussels, led by the European chief, Federica Mogherini, and they were pledging $8 billion to reconstruct Syria, the European countries. And it's pretty extraordinary that the Europeans would be stepping up to the plate because, frankly, Russia and Iran surely could be held responsible for propping up this Assad regime, and therefore, if you guys have kept him in power, you're responsible to foot the bill, for the massive bill to reconstruct this country. And I would think that that would give America some leverage over Russia, because the Russians don't have that kind of money, neither do the Iranians. So what was going on there? What were the Europeans doing, even talking about pledging $8 billion, and then the chemical weapons attacks, and of course that pretty much had Federica Mogherini, they're going to face, basically, then having to say that Bashar al-Assad is primarily responsible. Chemical weapons are the worst of war crimes, she said. So there's a couple of questions there. One is, what are Europeans up to? And two, why would Assad shoot himself in the foot like this? He wants all this money from the people who supported his enemies, frankly, and now it blew up in his face because he used chemical weapons.
Yeah, just on the second point first, I mean, I don't know why Assad used chemical weapons. I don't think anyone does. I haven't really seen a good explanation of it. I suspect the reason might be that if he thought he could get away with it, and he could use chemical weapons more broadly going forward, it would be, a devastating sort of blow to opposition's morale to see him being able to use the full sort of scale of his arsenal completely unconstrained, and that it will be sort of a finishing move to try to win the war and show that there was no chance of defeating him or getting to a stalemate. So I suspect that was the reason. On your very interesting question on the aid and why not just leave the bill with Russia and Iran. I think the reason is that the Europeans, are suffering the most of Western countries or countries outside the immediate vicinity of the civil war in terms of the repercussions of it. So the refugees crisis, came very close to collapsing the European Union. It may have contributed to Brexit. It created an enormous backlash in Europe. And so they are experiencing the consequences of the war, and if Syria continues to fall apart and the region falls apart, then they will bear the brunt of that. In a way, Russia doesn't care as much, because to the extent that the refugees flows destabilize the EU, that's actually aligned with Putin's interests in undermining the EU. And of course, the Russians and the Iranians aren't going to foot the bill, even if they should. So I think it's probably a sense that they have a strategic interest in stabilizing Syria and the countries around it. I do think it's obviously fairly, it's probably not enough, and it's a little premature in the sense that the war is still raging on, and there's just no sort of sign of that coming to an end or what a real negotiation process would look like. But I think that's probably why they were inclined in that direction. Well,
when you talk about leverage, in other words, I mentioned that the possibility that the U.S. has some leverage in these talks coming up with Tillerson and Putin in Moscow. The leverage being that, you guys are going to be left to foot the bill because you supported and protected and preserved the Assad regime. But on the other hand, does Putin have counter leverage, as you just pointed out? I think what's missed often is that when the Russians moved into Syria in September of 2015, shortly thereafter, the massive exodus of refugees took place, and the former Sakir, General Breedlove, said that Putin was weaponizing refugees. Assad and Putin, it looks like Assad and Putin worked together. Assad gave the people permission to get out. they'd, basically starve, get killed or get out. And thus, it does seem that Putin still has that leverage. There could be another flow of refugees into Europe, and he could pull the trigger on that. Is that a fact?
Yeah, I think he did weaponize the refugee flows. It may or may not have been his intention at the very beginning, but certainly when he saw it was possible, I think he welcomed it because he sees the EU as an existential threat to his regime, unfairly, I think, but that is the way he sees it. And I think he still has, he's a major military player on the ground shaping sort of the day-to-day development. So I think he does have a lot of leverage over Europe and over the United States. He's made himself sort of an indispensable player there, and he can certainly ratchet up the refugee flows if he wants. So, I think this is going to be a very interesting and important meeting with Tillerson, but I don't think that, I don't think Putin's going to be in any mood to sort of make major concessions. I think, if anything, he'll be frustrated at Tillerson for not being able to deliver, for the Trump administration not being able to deliver what it promised. I would worry a little bit that Tillerson will try to go a little too far in finding common ground, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, why do you think, though, that the West and NATO don't see the obvious here? Or maybe they do, but it doesn't look like it. The reason that Putin invaded Crimea, I think, is largely because of the Black Sea Fleet and the warm water ports. And the reason that he's committed to Syria is because he has naval bases there. To my mind, that's what it's all about. It's all about Russia's military power and its access to bases. Is that too simplistic?
Well, I think it's a huge part of it. I think you're exactly right that that's a major concern, but I think it's also more than that too, because my view is that in Crimea or in Syria, he could have, if he played a constructive role in the negotiations, he could have easily ensured the continuation of those bases. In Crimea, no one was really talking about getting rid of that base. It was just an association agreement with the EU. There was no prospect. That base wasn't going anywhere. And, he would have had tremendous leverage if he wanted additional guarantees on maintaining the base. I'm sure he could have gotten them. And I think similarly in Syria, people know what he's sort of capable of. And in post-war, negotiations for the post-conflict situation, I think it would have been fairly straightforward for him to secure those bases going forward, unless Assad had completely collapsed. So I think it's he obviously, I think, is very concerned about maintaining the bases, but I think he's also looking for ways to push back against the West to sort of undermine that post-Cold War order, to show that he is, he's capable of unilateral, bold moves that forces the West to react, and that he's making Russia a significant military player in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East.
Well, Thomas Wright, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Thomas Wright, who's a fellow and director of the Project on International Order and Strategy, as well as a fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. His forthcoming book is All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American. Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at ianmasters.com. And joining us now is Eric Bolett, who is a senior fellow at Media Matters for America and the author of Lapdogs, How the Press Rolled Over for Bush, and Bloggers on the Bus, How the Internet Changed Politics and the Press. He worked for 5 years as a senior writer for Salon.com, where he wrote extensively about media and politics, and prior to that he worked as a contributing editor to Rolling Stone. Welcome to Background Briefing, Eric Bolett.
Thanks for having me.
And Eric, there's been a considerable amount of cheerleading going on in the press. Of course, you expect the sort of sycophantic coverage from Fox News, who is, for all intents and purposes, have become the Pravda of the Donald Trump administration. However, it's surprising to see, for example, on CNN, Fareed Zakaria declared that after firing these missiles, I think Donald Trump became president of the United States last night. Of course, that has echoes of what CNN's Van Jones said earlier after Trump's first address to Congress. And then, of course, you also have Brian Williams quoting the lyrics of a Leonard Cohen song, I am guided by the beauty of our weapons, without any irony. So what did you make of it?
there was a few things. So those examples you point to were certainly troubling, right? Look, there's kind of an automatic in American politics and American media, particularly news television. When the United States drops bombs on people, it's a big deal. It's going to get banner, nonstop coverage. And initially, all the coverage is going to be really good. All the coverage is going to be a certain amount of awe, a certain amount of deferential. Assuming the generals and the president know exactly what they're doing, and things like that. So, I mean, if you go back to invasion of Grenada, if you go back to Panama, even these sort of small incursions, not even Gulf War I or Gulf War II, but even these small kind of 2 or 3 day events that we've seen over the last few decades, it really fawning coverage. When we invaded Panama, even though it turned out to be kind of a joke, the initial coverage was very rah-rah. So we got a lot of that. My main problem was the connection of the coverage to Trump, right? The connection to the coverage of this bombing, this one-time bombing of an airfield that we were told the next day was again operational. There was reports that we blew up a mess hall, presumably empty. We blew up a radar. We didn't hit any planes. We didn't dismantle the airfield. What I thought was particularly odd was the jumping off point from that to Donald Trump is now presidential, right? To Donald Trump has now ascended to a certain level of leadership. He's a sober, serious person. None of this is kind of based in fact, and I think it's the press is from the day he was inaugurated, the press has just been really, really anxious to normalize, to mainstream his behavior, which is not normal or mainstream, and they keep looking for glimpses and glimmer of hope that something he does will be considered statesman or courageous. And I guess they decided this one-time bombing of an airfield would do for now.
But you mentioned the invasion of Grenada, and that was, in retrospect, a classic wag the dog situation. What had happened is the U.S. Marines had been blown up in the barracks in Beirut the day before, and yeah. There was a flotilla of Marines heading for Beirut to reinforce. Oliver North had a plan ready for a wag the dog invasion of Grenada, and they jumped on it to take the Lebanon story off the headlines, and yeah. It was very successful. So, is there a wag the dog component in this?
Well, I mean, you have to be, even if you're slightly suspicious or cynical, you would think yes. If you look at what Trump has done, your radar is really going to be ticking because, my goodness, a week before the Secretary of State Tillerson made a public announcement where we don't really think Assad needs to be overthrown. We're fine. We're where he is. Yes, there was this dramatic and horrific chemical attack, but reports I've seen, this is the third chemical attack since Trump was sworn into office. Probably the first with as many images and television pictures. But this is not anyone who's followed this horrific fiasco for many years in Syria. No one would be surprised, unfortunately, that this necessarily happened. So why was this 180 in a few days? And look, and I think, of course, again, anytime we drop bombs, it's going to be a big deal. It was a very big deal because of how it happened, right? Everything that happens with Trump is so kind of bizarre and weird. We go from we're fine with Assad to 4 days later bombing his one of his airfields. There was no public discussion. He would barely even talk about what he wanted to do. So I think that added to the level of excitement or curiosity, however you want to describe it. Now, I will offer one caveat. During the Iraq War, the build-up to the war, the actual war, I would say there was an 18-month window where the U.S. press really, one of the biggest, most significant failures ever, right? They just got completely swept up in this war fever, and they backed this lie about WMDs. And for the first 6 or 8 months of the war, it was really not very good coverage. So with that in mind, I did see some real-time skepticism Thursday night into Friday. Some, probably not enough, but I did. To me, it wasn't just a complete failure. It wasn't complete lapdog coverage. I saw people on TV. I was reading things from serious people who were raising questions almost in real time, which, if we want to look for a silver lining, I think that would probably be the silver lining to this.
And again, I'm speaking with Eric Bolett, who is a senior fellow at Media Matters for America and the author of Lapdogs, How the Press Rolled Over for Bush, and Bloggers on the Bus, How the Internet Changed Politics and the Press. He worked for 5 years as a senior writer for Salon.com, where he wrote extensively about media and politics, and prior to that worked as a contributing editor to Rolling Stone. Now, the Russians are reporting that only 23 cruise missiles impacted the Syrian airfield. The U.S. military, Pentagon, said that they launched 59 missiles, one of which crashed shortly thereafter into the ocean. By the way, there are over 1.5 million apiece. So do you know anything? Has there been any reporting on the disparity between the Russian claim of only 23 impacting and the U.S. claim of 58 impacting?
Yeah, this is an important point that we haven't really seen that much about. We know almost nothing about what happened because certainly there's been very little information from the White House or the Pentagon, and so, right, it's kind of weird we're relying on Russian analysis or Russian evaluation. They put out some public statements, this is what they hit, this is what they missed, this is how many, the missiles arrived unscathed. It's kind of weird that why are we relying on the Russian government to kind of give us a very general idea of what happened with this U.S. attack? Even during, W. Bush's Iraq War, they embedded these troops for better or for worse. Some of the coverage became kind of rah-rah, but at least we kind of had an idea of what was going on. From what I can tell, the Pentagon has released almost no information about this, which again just raises the point. What was the goal? Was this part of an extended strategy? I did see a headline, someone quoting defense officials saying, "Well, we never meant to, take that airfield out. It was meant to send a message." Well, if you want to spend $100 million, I guess that's one way to send a message. But for the press, I would be a little more concerned that we really haven't had any updates per se. We really don't know what happened. And again, it's kind of odd. We have to rely on not the Syrian government. We're relying on a proxy ally to tell us what happened. This is all very unusual.
Right, but maybe at the end of the day, we might learn that these multi-billion-dollar weapon systems that we pay a fortune for don't work. We know the F-35, the most expensive weapon system in the history of man, doesn't work. And they've had cruise missiles for a long time. By and large, they've worked certainly better than the Russian cruise missiles have, which, some of them landed in Iran on their way to Syria. So that, I think, is an important question, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and what's the context? The context of this is Trump is asking for a Pentagon increase of $50 billion.
$54 billion, yeah.
$54 billion. And this is at a time when the Pentagon budget, with Democrats and Republicans in agreement, has been on the decline for certainly as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq wind down. There has been no Republican very little Republican attempt in the last 5 years to demand increase in the Pentagon budget. There's kind of a consensus that our budget is already, everyone knows the statistics, 10 times what most of the other industrial nations combined spend. But now Trump comes and he says, we're going to boost it by $54 billion, and people are looking at each other like, what are we going to do? We don't even know what to do with this money. Right. And so that's kind of that could be a helpful context for the press coverage. Like, is Trump asking for a $54 billion increase because he plans on, these $100 million kind of Tomahawk missile attacks on a regular basis around the world or things like that? So it's it's all very important in terms of the press and what they're covering and looking at the context. There was kind of some nonsensical narratives during the campaign that, Trump was maybe going to be an isolationist or a non-interventionist. I think the press needs to kind of be a bit more clear-eyed. Isolationists don't ask for a $54 billion increase in military budgets.
Well, a lot of it, I think, is at the end, just in closing, is to do with what the president sees on television. He apparently stays up late at night watching cable news, which I think is brain damage enough for anybody. I don't know why he does that, but apparently these images did affect him. So we could well have a president who may be influenced by images on television more than anything else. So,
well, just a quick point on that. I mean, that is his claim, right? I saw these images. I was so moved. I decided we need to bomb. Well, we know that Trump is kind of an Olympic liar, right? He lies about things large and small. And so I'm kind of suspicious of why the press would assume on this issue this is the one thing he's going to tell the truth about, right? Are we going to pretend that because it's an issue of life or death, suddenly Donald Trump can tell the truth about things? Or should the press look at it in the context of he physically has trouble telling the truth about anything? Therefore, why should we assume that the reason he told us we bombed Syria is the real reason, right? The New York Times the day after had this front page piece about how Trump was following his heart, right? He suddenly was this wildly empathetic figure. Well, there's nothing to suggest that happened. Anytime a president takes a country to war or even just a military event, the press should probably be skeptical or in a healthy way. When the president cannot tell the truth about virtually any topic and he leads a nation to a war, a military event, that skepticism really should be off the charts at that point, I would think.
I thank you very much for joining us here today, Eric Boehlert.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Eric Boehlert, who's a senior fellow at Media Matters for America and the author of Lapdogs, How the Press Rolled Over for Bush, and Bloggers on the Bus, How the Internet Changed Politics and the Press. He worked for 5 years as a senior writer for Salon.com, where he wrote extensively about media and politics, and prior to that he worked as a contributing editor to Rolling Stone.